we're going to sort of just round up for those of you who are here for the first time. We're going to just cover a little bit of the ground that we touched on last week, and then take it a little bit further. You know, identity for a people is so important.
100%, man.
Identity is the place from which you get your strength. Identity is the place from which you can move forward. Identity is the place from which you can plan for the future. Not having an identity it's like being an orphan, where you're here but you don't know how you got here. You don't know where you're going. You don't know your parents, and you don't know what your ties to this place, planet Earth, that is. You don't know what your ties are. So this sort of Black History segment is a way of sort of introducing you to this idea of identity. You've probably heard a lot of Black history, and you've heard about the accomplishments that we've made all over the world. But we want to talk specifically about those of you who are descendants of enslaved people, right? We want to sort of look at your identity specifically and help you to understand how you got here. Now, last week, we spoke about a little bit of science. We talked about something called craniometry.
Mm-hmm.
Craniometry is the study of skulls. So when scientists or anthropologists find skulls lying in the desert and they dig them up, they measure the skull, which tells them the racial identity of that person who died. Now, for Black people or Negroes, there is a specific classification for Negro skull. And that classification is called dolichocephalic. Okay, that's a new word.
Say it for them again, and phonetically, so they can pick it up.
Dolichocephalic. Dolichocephalic. So if we could just have the first slide, we'll see the spelling of it here, and just have a little bit of information about that slide number 1. So dolichocephalic, or otherwise known as long-headed. If you look at, maybe Mr. C, could you just read the underlined at the bottom of the page?
Yeah, so dolichocephaly, according to Ritzius, was the distinctive cranial feature of the earliest inhabitants of Europe. Today, it is characteristic of the Negro races.
Thank you.
So again, it goes on to say the Papuans, the Polynesians, and the Australians through.
Right.
So again, so it's not just Europe, but throughout many different places as well.
Right. So they've dug up many skulls across the European continent. Now, put that back up, please. They've dug up many skulls around many skeletons around the European continent, and are able to designate these skeletons as dolichocephalic. And dolichocephalic skulls, or Negroes, have been walking across Europe for thousands of years. We saw, I think it was last week when we saw Cheddar Man.
Mm-hmm.
If you recall, Cheddar Man was found in caves in Lancashire, dated about 7000 BC, with the indigenous people of Britain, of the British Isles, of Britain Island. It was a Black man. He was a dolichocephalic individual. And consequently, these dolichocephalic individuals were all over Europe. The ancient Saxons were said to be dolichocephalic, as we saw last week.
That's right.
We also saw that tribes called the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, these were all dolichocephalic peoples. So the idea that we've been sold that Black people only come from Africa is very much a lie.
It's a fib, fabrication, misdirection.
Right. Black people do come from Africa, but they come from everywhere else also. If you were to accept that Black people only come from Africa, then the implication of that is to accept then that white people must have come from everywhere else, which is obviously not true based upon the science. So dolichocephalic people were all over Europe. Next slide. And they basically lived everywhere in Europe. Today, though, I want to talk a little bit about Portugal and Spain, because
Mm.
this location is of great interest to you Black people, and you're going to see why. Now, in Spain, Spain and Portugal were originally ruled by the Romans for a period of time, and then it was invaded by the Visigoths, and then followed by the Muslims, and then it was what were known as the Catholics, right? So this is around 1492. And the main populations of Spain were indigenous Spanish. Some of them were Black, but by this time, some of them were white too. We had Muslims and we had Jews. These were the main populations that were living in Spain and in Portugal. Now, what happened is that the Catholic Church was a very powerful force, and still is to this day, right? And they basically were responsible for dictating who were believers and who were infidels. And one of the peoples that the Catholic Church really targeted a lot were the Jews. Now, why was that? Well, it's quite apparent when you look through the pages of history that many people around the world actually knew the history of the Jews, you know, through Moses and all that. They knew those stories, and they knew who these people were. And in fact, wherever these people settled, they became very, very influential. So they were involved in the sciences, in the arts, they worked in government, they collected taxes, and this was no different in Spain and in Portugal, okay? In fact, Spain and Portugal collectively is known as the Iberian Peninsula. Now, the Catholic Church did not like the fact that these Jews were very influential, right? They know that they came from far away. They had, you know, they had all this biblical history about them, and people within Spain and Portugal used to call on them to bless things like their crops, to bless their harvest. And this was a real annoyance to the church, because the church saw itself as the only representation of God on earth. So things started to get really bad, that they started to enact laws. Now, bear with me here. Next slide. Next slide. That's slide number 3. Right. So they started to put laws in place to restrict the activity of these Jews that lived in the Iberian Peninsula. So where I've underlined it, notice it says Canon 49. Now, canon is a law, right? Law put out by the church. Canon 49 forbade the blessing of Christian crops by Jews. So if you were a Spanish person or Portuguese person, you were not allowed to call upon a Jew to come and bless your harvest. Now, when you look at that law, what that law tells you is how influential the Jews were and what was really thought about them, and the fact that the Catholics had to suppress them because they did not want them to have that type of spiritual authority. And so what happened is that they were eventually forced to basically convert to Catholicism. This is what was known as the Catholic Inquisition. So many of you would have heard about this in school, the Catholic Inquisition.
Spanish Inquisition, we called it at school.
Right, Spanish Inquisition, right? It's the Spanish Inquisition or the Catholic Inquisition, because it happened in both Spain and Portugal.
Oh, right.
Both Catholic countries, right? So we did that in school, didn't we? But most of that stuff really kind of went in one ear, went in one ear and out the other, right? But this was brought upon, okay? This was brought upon these people. And if we look at the next slide, Mr. C, just to sort of, if you could just read the underlines for that, please, for us.
Okay, so so Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon ordering the expulsion of all unconverted practicing Jews from the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. The primary purpose of the expulsion was to eliminate the influence of unconverted Jews on Spain's by then large Jewish origin, New Christian converso population. Good. Wow.
So basically, the Jews, these Jews in Portugal, were forced to convert to Catholicism. Some of them did, some of them didn't, right? But the ones that didn't, they had to drive them out, right? They had to drive them out. So the reason being for that is because they didn't want them to discourage their brothers who were converted to go back to practicing their Jewish religion. So they drove these people out. Okay. Now, what did they do with them? Well, when they drove them out, a lot of these people went to this place. Next slide. Next slide, please. This is where they went. That's right. Yep, that's it. This is where they went. They went across the Strait of Gibraltar into Morocco and basically fled down into Africa and particularly the West. Right? Where they met in the West existing communities of Hebrews who were already living there for hundreds of years. So they fled from Portugal across the Strait of Gibraltar into Africa, right? So that's interesting. So we have a group of people persecuted across the Strait of Gibraltar into Africa. So why is this important? Next slide. Mr. C, if you could please, with your great eyes.
Africans also settled along parts of the Malabar coast during the 17th and 18th centuries. These were black Jews, descendants of African slaves.
Sorry, can you just read that again? Because I didn't hear that. What did you say?
These were black Jews, descendants of African slaves. Wow.
One more time. I don't think people heard that. One more time.
Africans who settled along parts, these people were black Jews. These Africans, these were black Jews, descendants of African slaves.
Right. So that's taken from a book.
And also, sorry, Tony, I just want to pick out the next bit. They said who had left Cochin and Kerala in southern India.
Right.
To come and settle on that coast. So this is letting you know that black Jews also came from southern India.
And if you remember, of course, a few weeks ago, I did show some video footage of some of our brothers who are in India, even to this day, they've been there for 400 years. If you haven't seen that, then you probably have to go back and look at some of the earlier videos. But the point being here is that these people are identified. So these Jews that came from Portugal into Africa and met their brothers were, Mr. C, what were they?
Black Jews.
Black Jews. Notice they were black Jews, descendants of African slaves. So remember, this discussion is about identity, right? It's not about black. There are hundreds of black nations around the world. Not all of them are the same. Black is not one homogeneous group of people. Black is split between hundreds of nations. We are talking about one specific nation. Next slide. And that's the book that it's quoted from. It's called The General History of Africa. You can take a screenshot of that if you want. You can find that book on the internet.
So, yeah.
Next slide, please. So, Mr. C, again, please, if you could help me, let's read that paragraph together.
Some historians have noted that the presence of Sephardi, is that correct? Sephardi Jews in Portuguese. Sephardi Jews in Portuguese West Africa by researching records from the Portuguese Inquisition relating to the New World. These show that there was significant Sephardic presence in Angola and Guinea trading posts and that the Portuguese settlements were crucial.
Thank you. So remember, Sephardi Jews are those Jews that came across the waters from Portugal into Africa. So what color were these people?
Black.
Answers on the postcard, please, right? Next slide.
Sephardi Jews and Mizrahi Jews living primarily in the Maghreb of North Africa, including Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia, as well as Sudan and Egypt. Some were established early in the diaspora, others after the expulsion from Iberia in the late 15th century.
Right. So the ones that we're particularly interested in, right, are Sephardi Jews. So when you see Sephardi, you mean Spanish. When you see Spanish, you're talking about Inquisition. When you talk about Inquisition, you're talking about they had to flee. And the nearest place they fled into was into Africa in the West. Right? So these were the black Jews. Let's just throw the map up again, please, so we can have a bit of a detailed look at the map of where they went. Hopefully you've got a big enough screen that you can see this map. Well, this map is from the 18th century, but if you look right in the middle, sort of the middle strip, notice that that land is called
Negro land.
That is how you got your definition as Negroes. See? So many of these people who escaped from Portugal went to these parts and they settled there. Next slide. Another close up here, if we look very close. Okay, this is like where we're looking at sort of Benin, Togo area now. And in the 1700s, if you look at it very carefully, it tells you that this place is called the Kingdom of Judah. Can you see at the top there? Just the top of that, right? So why is a place in Africa called the Kingdom of Judah? Judah was a place in Israel. It is a specific tribe of Israel, and it was called. And then, incidentally, if you go, just cast your eyes down further a little bit. What coast is it?
Slave Coast.
Slave Coast. So you got something associated with Israel in the same area as something associated with the transatlantic slave trade. Next slide. So we saw that. Next slide, please. Next one again. Right, Mr. C. This is about Jamaica now for you, for the Jamaicans that are here.
Okay. Am I just reading the underline bit? Yeah. Okay. So this is to do with ethogenesis. The first Africans to arrive in Jamaica came in 1513 from the Iberian Peninsula.
Right.
Wow.
So in the Caribbean, we've been told that black people came to the Caribbean from Africa. But according to historians, and Jamaican historians know this too, the first enslaved peoples that were brought to Jamaica did not come out of Africa. They came out of the same Portugal that they were forced out of because of not converting. The timeline is exactly the same. But notice how they cleverly say the first Africans. This goes back to what I've always been banging a drum about. You see the first Africans. Whenever they talk about black people, it's always Africa, Africa. They can't really say, because they are vested interests here, they can't really say directly who these people were. So they say African to make you think, oh yeah, well, if they're African, they must have been black. But we previously saw that people escaped out of the Iberian Peninsula, they went into Africa, and some of them ended up in the Caribbean. And not just Jamaica. Next slide.
The Jewish arrival in Barbados is a direct consequence of the Spanish Inquisition.
Thank you. Right? So black people, I'm not gonna try and make things up and lie to you for the sake of lying. This is all verifiable. You can look this up for yourself.
And also, no, go on. A lot of these people. Sorry, Tony, finish what you're saying.
A lot of these people arrived in the Caribbean, not directly from Africa.
And also, it's very good. Even if you're looking at the continuation in 1492, some Sephardic Jews had fled the persecution in the Liberian Peninsula for Brazil, where they remained until the 17th century. So again, You know, I have to say this because it always surprises me how a lot of black people don't realize that there's more Africans displaced in Brazil than anywhere else in the world. But again, this is saying that again that this is the Sephardic Jews,
Right.
so not necessarily came from, as you're saying, Tony, Africa per se, but from Portugal and Spain as well.
Right.
Fantastic,
Remember,
man.
Brazil is a Portuguese colony.
Mm.
It's run by the Portuguese.
Yeah.
So you've got you know, it's a bit like how the British used to take their convicts and criminals and send them to Australia. And
that's hence why Britain's got such a big rule over the country now.
Right. So let me just add some clarification to what we're saying. So you had something called a Catholic Inquisition, right? Those people who lived there, who were forced to convert to Catholicism and refused, ran into Africa. They went across the Strait of Gibraltar. They moved into communities where there were already their fellow brethren who had been there for hundreds of years. So they knew them. So they settled in those areas. Now, the Portuguese had allies in those areas, and they actually chased these Jews into Africa, using their allies as contractors to get them so they could take them on ships. Right? So they chased them because the Portuguese worked for 200 years. They were really the powerhouse, you know, from about the 14th to 16th century. They were really the powerhouse. They were the first European nations to really get slavery rolling. But part of their agenda was the fact that they knew that these people they ran into Africa. They knew where they were. They had alliances with other black nations who were not Jews. They weren't chasing them. And they used to trade with them. But part of the trade also was that they wanted these people to find these individuals and bring them so they could take them to the New World, because they had just established new colonies in Brazil. And so that's what happened. And that's what happened. So you had that, and also the transportation out of Portugal. See? So with that, now you have a situation where you're having people coming out of Africa to the Caribbean. They're coming out of Portugal, and the other Jews that got away, they spread themselves out throughout Europe. They went to Holland, they went to Germany. Some ended up in Britain during that time, but the vast majority of them were taken across the Atlantic and enslaved. Now, what's interesting about these people is that they knew their history, right? They had something called the Torah. Right? The Torah is what we would call basically the Tanakh, which is basically the Old Testament of the Bible. Right? They know they had that was their holy book. Their ancestors wrote that book. Now it's quite interesting that a little examination of that book reveals something so fascinating. You have to wonder whether or not they actually saw it themselves. Next slide. So in their own Torah, right, this verse taken from the Bible, or the Torah itself, actually is there. This is the Torah they had. They knew this. And it actually was a prophecy that they as a people would be taken into bondage with ships, sold, and they would never be rescued. So this is the very holy book that they had. They knew, they learned it from they were youths. And this is what was written there. Now, how long were they going to be in this situation for? Next slide. They answer it in their own writings. They were going to be forced into slavery and be oppressed for 400 years. So how ironic that you would be suffering something like that, which your ancestors wrote about you. And they took them to the Western Hemisphere. They were spread out throughout the world. They were also taken into India and various other places, the Middle East. A few weeks ago, we saw I think it was Turkey that we were looking at, about some of the people that were in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
But 400 years was a designated time that they would be enslaved and oppressed. Now, if you've never heard this before, and this is kind of new to you, I understand. It kind of blew me away when I first heard it. But I've looked it, and just so we can ensure that we're not making things up, I want to sort of look at a little video clip, and let's have someone sort of confirm to us what this is about. Next slide.
Another area in Africa you have something big happening is in Nigeria. You have the Igbo people, or Igbo, pronounced either way. There's 40 million of them. There's been books written about it from scholars in Nigeria, from scholars from the Jewish people. And where it gets interesting is, in America, there was a slave trade. And a lot of the slaves, a very high percentage of them, came from Western Nigerian ports. And in America today, you see a very large movement of African Americans who say that they're the real chosen people, that they're the children of Israel, they're the Judeans. You know, so what are they just trying to create an identity for themselves because they were slaves, or is there really something here? And the answer is, most likely there is something there. And most likely, maybe that they were the original Israelites, and maybe that the Jewish people today, who are white, Caucasian people, came in a little bit later on.
I want to discuss a little bit.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So notice what he says. And this is a rabbi, right? He's also a historian, so it's quite respected. So he points out that, yeah, maybe they were. And then perhaps the white Jewish people, they came in afterwards, right? But that's a story for another time. But the point being that there's so much confirmation about you. The only people who don't know about this is you.
Mm.
So let's just run another quick video confirmation. This is from a South African politician. Some of you will know him. His name is Julius Malema, very influential in South Africa, firebrand, militant brother. But notice what he had to say. Next video.
Another area in Africa you have something big happening is in Nigeria. You have the Igbo people, or Igbo, pronounced either way. There's 40 million of them. There's been books written about it from scholars in Nigeria, from scholars from the Jewish people. And where it gets interesting is, in America, there was a slave trade. And a lot of the slaves, a very high percentage of them, came from Western Nigerian ports. And in America today, you see a very large movement of African Americans who say that they're the real chosen people, that they're the children of Israel, they're the Judeans. You know, so what are they just trying to create an identity for themselves because they were slaves, or is there really something here? And the answer is, most likely there is something there. And most likely, maybe that they were the original Israelites, and maybe that the Jewish people today, who are white, Caucasian people, came in a little bit later on.
I want to discuss a little bit.
We played that again for emphasis. So the next, number 18, please. The next slide. Number 18. That's what we want to hear. So I don't know, people, how you feel about this, but the history is laid out. It's once you follow the dots, you're going to get to understand why you're in this position. Why are you, wherever you find yourselves in the world, you are either oppressed, persecuted, the laws are not helping you, your young people are not getting work, disproportionate amount of black men in jail, not doing well through the education system. This is the answer. This has all to do with your history. And without understanding your history, you can't know how to move forward. You can't know how to move forward. You can't move forward from where you are because you don't understand how you got here.
Yeah. Denise Francis says prophecy being fulfilled. Yeah, man.
Yeah.
And Lorraine agrees with you. Is this not still going on? So
Correct.
true. So true.
Correct. And so in order to chart a journey, it's not good just to look at where you are and where you're going. That's why a lot of us in our WhatsApp groups and stuff, we're like, yeah, what we need to do is get together, build some schools, some banks and all that. Well, it's not that easy. If you look at the history, you understand why things like Black Wall Street failed, right? Why some of the projects we tried to get off the ground have not been successful. It's your problem, Black people, it's not just the physical things that you're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
The root of your problem is actually spiritual.
Okay.
And you're trying to cure a spiritual problem with a physical answer. And you will always fail doing that. You've got to go back to the spiritual root of how you got to be in this position in the first place. Then you can start addressing the problems that we have as a nation. You can't take it from here. We can't even just start at slavery, which has always been pummeled into us. We have to go way before that. Because the big question that has to be asked right now is, okay, so we were in Portugal, we were taking the slaves, but the question is why? Why?
So we have to ask you the big question, Tony. Why?
So hopefully, we're hoping that the producer's got the next slide ready for us. If he hasn't got the video, then at least a slide after that would be nice. We got that slide?
Probably number 19, number 20.
There you go. So look, in the very Torah, this is the question that we have to ask. If what I'm saying is true, and if this is actually real, then what have we done to deserve this? If the history of these people means that they belong to the Most High, well, why would the Most High treat you like this? Right? So I'm going to leave it here for today, because next week
we're going to ask.
I'm going to tell you what.
Oh, I was just about to say, because you must have want riot to start, Tony.
I'm going to tell you what.
You can't set Black people up like that with a big why, and then what? You don't answer it. So boy, next week, people, leading off from Jeremiah 16:10, we're gonna deal with the big question: why? Oh man, do you think people will be ready for this question, Tony, for the answer?
Well, as Bob Marley says, "I don't business if they're ready. It's coming to them."
So remember, ladies and gentlemen, don't shoot the messenger. Tony, that was absolutely fantastic. I mean, again, some wonderful comments with it from our viewers. Lorraine Rollins says it's good to have knowledge on our history. Angela says yes, it is that whence the Black Irish of Jamaica book. CJH would like to know when the 400 years are up. I'm sure this question will be answered next week. Jen says, thanks for this very informative piece of history. Actually, something my son probably wanted to know about. Again, Lorraine says, we need to understand, acknowledge, and progress, move forward. It's good to. And Christopher Gatt says, love this man, Tony. Preach it, bro. Yeah, also my son and I've been discussing the same thing as what Jen was saying. Thank you for the informative, insightful piece of history. My son and I have been discussing the same thing. So listen, people, what a week it's been. Tony, I just have to say again, man, thank you so much, my brother, for just taking the time to break that down to us again. From just something as simple as the skulls, again, where they're found, where we've been, our journey, our history, the knowledge, and bringing it back to a spiritual awareness of ourselves, not just as individuals, but also collectively as people. And also making us understand that even though we are all black, we are not all the same type of black. No, Steve McQueen, I wasn't just talking about you. I was just talking in general.
He's your Steve. He's your Steve. He's all right.
Steve, you're cool, man. You're cool. So listen, ladies and gentlemen, I know we went a little bit over time, but it was a special one. Next week, we're going in deep. So please, if you can get your children to watch, Tony's going to do a brief recap again of all what he shared with us over the last 2 months. It's so important for our young people, not just our young people, but also the wise amongst us, our elderly generation, the Windrush generation, know this information as well. Because if the youngers and the olders don't know this information, then collectively we don't know enough about ourselves collectively. So it's important that you get your grandparents, your aunties, your uncles, your children, your nephews, your nieces, your godchildren to watch next week's show as well. We want you to continue on with the discussion, the learning, and most importantly, sharing the knowledge. Tony, final words from yourself, sir?
We can't move forward, black people, unless we go back.
So next week on What a Week, we're going back. We're going to take it spiritual, and we're going to be sharing the knowledge with you. Thank you so much for all of you who've been watching and listening. Please make sure that you do like, subscribe, and share. And we'll catch you back same time, same place, Tuesday, 7 p.m. right here on What a Week. He's been Tony Crossbody.
He's been Mr. C.
God bless. Live, love, laugh.